Hi, I'm Justin Mormon.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 7, Changes Reforming School Discipline. So always a touchy subject when you start talking about discipline and how schools do that. And any kind of change in that always gives people like a little pause. Like I think people will initially be like, first of all, none of us love change necessarily. And a lot of teachers find their system and they like to work within that system. And so then all of a sudden when it's something like discipline, especially that seems to not be most people's like expertise. Like I think that freaks them out when we say that there's going to be a change to that. Don't you think?
Yeah. I think people are not sure how to respond or even see why. So I think that's where we're going to start. Why does this need to change? Yeah.
Why do those discipline policies need to change? I was looking up, and this is such like a not public speaking, like you probably shouldn't do this kind of thing. But I was like, I'm going to look up the definition of discipline because that's what people want to hear me read. But what's interesting is that so I Googled it first, right? Because nobody uses like a real dictionary anymore. And if you do, God bless you, I guess. But I thought it was interesting because on Google, it was said like the practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. Man, that sounded so negative. I was like, holy cow, is that like the definition of discipline? So then I went to like a dictionary, like a Webster dictionary kind of website. And it was like a little bit different, which I thought was interesting. If we had more time, I'd love to. It would be so interesting to talk about. Like, I wonder if like Google's version of the definition, like if that's shifted like more modern, right? But you have words like, again, obey the rules, code of behavior, punishment to correct the disobedience. But then the other definition was more like orderly or prescribed conduct or pattern of behavior or training that corrects or molds or perfects the mental faculties or moral character. That sounded way more positive, right? Like we're training people as opposed to punish them.
Well, that's the lens shift, right?
And that is. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, and I think I've heard it time and time again as discipline really comes from discipleship, which is to teach, right? Yeah. It's to teach others. So if we're really looking...
To not punish.
It's not punishing. We're teaching.
Right, just to punish
intervening, giving experiences for, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that it's important as we start this conversation before we talk about like why this needs to change, but like that we don't hear us asking why do discipline policies need to go away altogether?
No.
That's not like, don't hear that. Like if there's one thing we don't want you to hear, it's that, because we're not saying that. Like it shouldn't be that discipline policies go away altogether.
We need rules, we need boundaries.
And it's a free for all. Yeah, hopefully you start catching that theme from us. Boundaries, good. Like
consequences are necessary.
Consequences, necessary. Yeah. Expectations, good. Like we need all of those things. But I think that's what people initially hear when they hear that we're going to change how discipline is. And then they're like, well, then just anything goes. And don't hear that. Yeah, don't hear that through this conversation.
It's good. And I think it's necessary. You think the last big reform in school discipline policies were probably when zero tolerance policies were initiated, which was like the mid-90s.
Yeah.
I think really look at your own district. When was the last time you really reformed discipline? We look at curriculum every 5 years to update and reform, right?
Yeah.
So, but we don't ever really look at our discipline policies. It's time. Research has changed tremendously.
Since the mid-90s.
Since the mid-90s, yeah.
It's been a long time, yeah.
All this research is out there that says, well, actually, this is how, if we want to help and support and correct behavior, here's what we need to do. And actually, it's been harmful. The discipline policies that we did put in effect in the mid-90s with the zero tolerance policies actually led to the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
So we know our minority students, our students with disabilities, our students in poverty were 3 times the rate of being disciplined compared to the same as another child, based upon the same rule, but because of our unconscious bias and lots of other systematic things that are going on in our school systems, we're over disciplining certain subpopulations, which is impacting the school to prison pipeline. So that's essentially why we have to change, and that's where a lot of the response to that multi-tiered system of supports are coming, is to reform that part of it.
Yeah, and so like, why do you think? So it's very much what people tend to like, I don't know if that's the best way to say it. I think what we've had before that is hard for us to break away from is that one size fits all kind of mentality. Why do you think that? Like, why do you think we like that? What is it
I think
that you
it's
think we
I
like
think
about
it's
that?
comforting, right? Because we don't train teachers or administrators about all the neuroscience and all the trauma, the stuff
Sure.
that you're here listening about now.
Yeah.
Most administrators probably can't walk in a room and give a PD on it, so they don't have the background. So what I do know is I have this handbook,
Sure.
and this handbook I'm going to keep order because
Yeah.
I can go, okay, violation of line 3. Here's my output.
This is
You're
what
suspended for
happens.
3 days.
Yeah.
And that we know, I think suspensions have been, I think there's lots of research to support suspensions do not work. It does not reform behavior. Is there a time and place where maybe that does need to occur? I don't know. I think those
Yeah.
are things we should talk
Sure.
about. But overall, we're way over suspending. So we're taking kids out of tier 1 instruction, out of school. There is no proof or research that says, yep, that changed that kid's whole behavior and outcome. Way to go.
Yeah.
That kid will never fight in school again. You've took him
Yeah.
out for 3 days.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
that
really
showed
just a break. Yeah.
that showed him it's a break in space, which sometimes that's needed.
Sure.
But that's not changing or reforming any behavior. And if we're really looking for supporting kids, we have to look at, instead of saying what consequences the kid need, what intervention does the child need, what experience does the child need. That's what we need to do if we're really about the kids and teaching and changing the system.
Yeah, I think there's that aspect of like not having to make a decision, not in a bad way, but I think that, teachers and then administrators are making so many decisions all the time and are constantly questioning and are questioned more than they probably were 20 years ago on like what decision we made. Their parents are much more likely to kind of question if what we're doing is best. And so I think when you can just go to the flow chart, right, you can go to the grid and see what you have to do. I think there's comfort in that. I think it also just saves us time. You can't be wrong, right? You can't be wrong because I just followed I don't know. I followed
Yeah.
what the paper said. So I'm not wrong. Like I can't, sorry, take it up with
Yeah.
whoever handed me the paper, I guess.
Yeah, we've got to look at kids holistically, and that's what that multi-tier system of support is really pushing us to do, is look at kids holistically. And if you go back to previous episode, we know about trauma, about history, about each kid's environmental factor. What I need to do with Justin is not going to be what they need to do with Katie.
Yeah.
2 different stories, 2 different backgrounds, and how can we help and support the child for where they're at, and what is the next zone of proximal development thing that we need to put into place to shift that behavior. So we shouldn't look at behavior any different than we look at academics. You wouldn't punish a kid for not learning how to read, right?
Sure.
We put interventions in place. So if a kid doesn't know how to do this at school, you need to put an intervention in place. No different, and think where that scaffold level of support needs to be.
That's how I taught my own kids to read. Was just I just
Punished
them
it right
until
out of them. Yeah.
And then they were like, I'll read now.
Got it.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so like, what are some of the misconceptions as we talk about this shifting? Like, I didn't do that, by the way, in case you didn't pick up on that. That's not what I did. What are the misconceptions, or some of the misconceptions about this work? And I guess like this work being like shifting to a different approach.
Yeah, I think a lens shift, right? I think we hear constantly, which we will overcorrect this probably more than we need to, but that there's no boundaries, there's no consequences.
Yeah.
The kids are running the school, right? That everything just goes. I think that's a giant misconception in school right now. That as a classroom teacher, it's not my job to do this. I'm here to teach and instruct, and if you're not here to learn, got to get out. I think the multi-tier system of supports, I'm going to keep on going back to that, which is federal law, says, guess what? Social, emotional, behavior, academics. And what we know about relationships, about regulation, about building resiliency, that as a classroom teacher, you've got to be involved in that part, or you will never have those learning partnerships in the classroom if you do not take that as part of your job. It is part of our job now. So I think this is a shift where teachers are like, well, I've never had to deal with it. That's why I think it is so important for districts to start prioritizing talking to teachers about behavior, discipline, and all the things we're talking about. If we don't start doing that, teachers will never get those other parts of the wheel, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't just assume people are being told to do something they've never had PD or a toolbox to develop on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I should point this out. This is the most fired up I've seen you so far in our podcast. Like you're like this is.
It is because I see it over and over again. I've never had to deal with this.
I'm worried you're going to attack me right now.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. But no, I think you have seen it, at in varying levels as you've gone and you've had a bunch of different positions, and I think you see it in different ways over your career.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think that idea that the shift is hard. And I think part of that is that we can hear teachers then say, like, does that mean that everything I did before was wrong? I was wrong, and I maybe did a poor job of things. And I think that it's important to hear that this doesn't mean that you're just wrong and that you somehow screwed up for the last 12 years of your career or something like that. It's just you didn't know. You maybe didn't know better, or you were working in the system that existed.
You were following what you were
Yeah.
asked to do, and that's okay too.
Yeah, and that's okay. And just like we adjust educational practices as we learn new things, this is just another adjustment like that. You don't have to necessarily feel guilty about it. You don't necessarily have to defend what was before. You don't have to do that. It's okay that that existed, and it's also okay that we know more and that we change now. And I think that's important to hear because people can get stuck on that idea that if I go along with this shift, then that means I was wrong before. And what does that say about what I did with kids? And then I think that idea that discipline is completely going away and that boundaries are going away, right? But I also think it's important to stop in this moment and realize that sometimes the early adopters of this shift have not always done a great job. We can land way too heavy on the regulation side, which is important if you listen to our last episode. But what we have to be careful of is just regulating and then not having a boundary or an expectation and not following through with what comes next. But we're just regulating. Now you feel better and you can kind of do whatever you want again. And oh, no, now you're dysregulated, but now I regulated you and you can now you're good and you can do whatever you want again. Now you're dysregulated. And that's insanity too. That's awful. And that's really hard for teachers to handle. But I think at times, people with good intentions of helping with regulation may have perpetuated this belief that means there are no boundaries and there's no discipline and there are no expectations. So we have to be careful about if you're somebody that's implementing this and doing some of this work, you have to understand that people do come by that feeling honestly sometimes that's what it is because maybe they've seen that before. And I think if you're one of the people doing this work, be very aware that you don't fall into a bad pattern of not having boundaries or expectations, and that there is follow through. But I just think that's super important to talk about.
Yeah, that's so good. We see that people will be like, "Well, I regulated." Okay, but there's no boundaries.
Yeah.
So at some point, we might have to ride out through some of that dysregulation to kind of follow through on some expectations.
Because stuff still does have to get done. We still are at school, and there are expectations that
Yeah.
it's not just let's just all hang out and be regulated all day long. Like
Yeah.
we're there for a purpose as well.
Yeah, it's finding that balance.
Yes, which is hard.
That's the hard part, and that's why there is no rule book or playbook.
Yeah, that's why there's not. Yeah, there's no flow chart. Yeah,
the human influence of how that looks with the dynamic of the teacher and the group of kids and all those kind of things. But it's that experience piece we have to keep on building. I also feel like the other part I think we hear a lot about is the other kids in the classroom.
Yes.
Other kids they can't be in here. They're dysregulated, right? And sometimes that is the case. That's not. We have to respect kids' privacy and let them have a moment, maybe not in the classroom, right?
But what about the other 19 kids?
Yeah,
right? Which is
think
a valid question.
We hear that all the time, and I think one thing I read this really good article the other day, and it said, but they're seeing you respond to someone who's having a hard time with love, with empathy, with care, with boundaries, and we're teaching and modeling. How do we respond to people who need us the most?
Yeah.
It's not that you don't belong here, get out, you don't fit in this group, we don't accept you. We're teaching them that sense of community and compassion. And kids are so understanding and they respond and are actually, it's really cool to see kids go up and co-regulate each other.
Yeah.
Or say, hey, are you okay?
I think that's an interesting thought too. Cause like we talk about how do you teach social emotional learning, how do you teach empathy? How do you teach some of these things that we're expecting kids to have? And while we do have curriculums that are specifically set aside, maybe you do take time in the morning or the afternoon or after lunch or whatever it looks like to intentionally teach some of those things. I think that what you're saying is that's something that can be feathered in all day long.
Yeah.
That this kid doesn't have to be other, or that this group of kids, they don't have to be other than, but they can actually, they're a part. And I'm teaching my whole class right now, even though we're still in the middle of like a math lesson, but I'm also teaching, about regulation. I'm teaching about how to handle emotions, and I'm teaching about how to approach each other by my reactions. I think that's really good.
Yeah, because how many times we say as adults we're having a hard time navigating that because we were never around somebody that was dysregulated. They
Yeah.
were out.
Yeah.
We
Got
never
kicked out.
saw somebody interact with somebody that was having a hard time. We have this perception of people, well, you can't, I'm sorry, you can't come because you don't fit all this criteria, right? Like
Yeah.
this kind of like exclusionary practice that kind of is like embedded in our society. So we're modeling that sense of all are welcome here and here's what it looks like. But doesn't mean it's not without love or without boundaries or compassion. But the kids are seeing you do that, which is awesome. And then I think the other thing I was thinking about was talking through to your point about regulation and then not putting the boundaries up. I think one thing we've done a lot when we've been teaching about this practice, just with real people in lifetime,
Yeah.
but just talking about like the plan, like you go to Dr. Ross Green's plan A, B, and C, which we'll do a whole separate podcast on this. But there's a time where you have to set the boundary and that's just what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Or if you look at or the plan C where sometimes you just have to drop and let it go. And there's a time where it's a plan B and that you're going to solve a problem with kids. So I think the other part, I think the misconception is that I can never tell a kid that's where we're at.
Yeah.
Or it's okay to let it go. But you have to find that balance on when you need to pick and choose. Same with the restorative practice, right? Diagram. There's a time you're going to do stuff for, there's going to times you're going to do stuff to kids, and there's going to be times you're going to do stuff with kids. Well, those will be separate episodes. But I do think it's important to say, like, sometimes it's just okay. That's the hard boundary because you're not being safe right now, and this is what we're going to do.
Yeah. And that's part of, I mean, that's all that tough stuff of being a teacher, right? Like, is reading those situations and understanding when to do what. And again, even then, there's not like a right or wrong. I think that's really hard for teachers to understand sometimes, is that there's not a right or wrong. Like, I did the right thing, I did the wrong thing. Sometimes you just made the best choice you could in that moment. And that's the choice you made. And now we're going to follow through with that, whatever that looks like, And so that can be hard, I think. Okay, so how do we approach discipline now?
I think it goes back to we've got to start giving people some PD on some of this stuff. And it's not like we'll say this over again, it's not the one-time PD because people will go try things and people need reflection time. They need to talk it through. They need to be coached through. They need to feel heard. They need to have a team approach, give time and space.
Yeah, and that's very much where we've landed. I mean, I think that experientially, that's what we've experienced. Like we had whatever experience we had as teachers for however long. Then we started getting trained in all this work, and in trauma and in social emotional learning, like all these things, different ways of discipline, all of that. And then we went back and we're like, well, let me think about how this fits with what I'm already doing. And then maybe we tried some more things and we went to like another training or like the next part of the training. And then we heard some more and we're like, oh, let me try this other thing a little different. Or, oh, no, I understand why that thing that I did do works, but why it didn't work with that one kid maybe. And I think we don't provide that a lot. We really, as districts, we want to check boxes to say that we've done stuff a lot because a lot of stuff is mandated for us. And so I think sometimes we get stuck in that unfortunate rhythm of like, okay, well, we did this. We presented the professional development, but people need somebody to kind of come alongside them and check in over and over and over again and have the conversations about it. Like you learn so much like after school in conversations with your peers about how stuff got handled.
Yeah, and I think it's the confidence. I feel like people question. I think it's building confidence and capacity so people feel more confident about approaching stuff, but that comes with experience.
Yeah.
So if we don't allow people to have the experience and then have the time to reflect and then to figure out some different ways to respond, and then the more people can get on board, the more perspectives you may have to help approach and support kids on an individual basis. But it's building the capacity of those teams to do that.
Yeah. And I think as a teacher, hear that it's okay to try things. Like nobody's expecting you to just be, again, perfect, that you made all the quote unquote right decisions every time. And that you're a person. You're not like some robot that just knows exactly what to do. But you also have to have enough grace for yourself to be like, I'm going to try something, and it may or may not.
Goes back to vulnerability.
Yep.
I may fail.
I may fail. I may get hurt. Yeah.
And then I have to decide if I'm going to try again. I even saw a teacher do a really great restorative conversation with kids, and I was just so happened to be like in earshot, and I was like kind of listening. And I was like, wow, that was really, I complimented the teacher. I said, hey, that was really great. I love that conversation you just had with those kids.
Was it me? Was I the teacher?
I don't think it was you. That was kind of weird.
Yeah. That's okay.
And the teacher said, well, I didn't know if I was doing it right. I said, oh, It was great. There's no script. Like
Yes.
the questions you asked, the compassion you had, the boundaries you set, that was absolutely perfect. You did a great job. But I feel like it's just interesting how just the confidence piece, I think sometimes,
Yeah.
so like, am I going to do it wrong? I think we do this all the time. Like, hey, we handled that. That was probably not the thing
Yeah.
to do, but I'm going to go back tomorrow and adjust.
This is what I did.
Yeah.
It's probably wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I did not get the result I thought I was going to get. Yeah.
Yeah. So then you adjust, right? And that's some of these trickier kids that are in maybe like a tier 3 or maybe on IEPs that have some tougher behavior. You're constantly in this mode of adjustment.
Yeah.
But that depends on the relationship and the regulation practices. And that's why it always goes back to that. What's your relationship? How are you able to keep this kid regulated? And where are you ready to ride out the boundaries with more of a natural consequence approach, which I know that will be a separate episode that we'll dive into a little bit more.
No, I think that's good. I think so much of this approach too has to do with us then, as opposed to even the kid. And I think that's what's hard. I think that's sometimes like intimidating. I mean, that's kind of what we're saying, like in all of this, but like how, I think it also goes back to like kind of how am I feeling? What can I do to help this student out? What capacity do I have today? Not just as a person overall, but like we're constantly, and every teacher is constantly having to evaluate, is today the day that I have to be able to see this thing through?
Is this the hill I'm dying on today?
Or is it not? And maybe tomorrow is. And that doesn't mean that I was saying it was fine today, but I didn't have it in me today to do it.
Or that. Yeah.
So you have to evaluate that. That's why I think it's important not to feel like every time I see X thing happen, this is the reaction I have to have, because some days you may not have the capacity for that. And it's probably not going to end the world if you wait and you address something tomorrow instead. Yeah. And then like what, kind of that reflection of like, what was I doing? What kind of practices, how did I have my classroom set up that all leading up to whatever this thing is that we're seeing, this behavior or this reaction from a kid that I didn't want to see, or whatever it might be. Like, what are the things that I was doing proactively ahead of time that maybe either led to or prevented, things from getting worse than what I wanted them to.
I think the biggest shift we're going to be making when we talk about discipline is that we're going to start solving problems with kids. Yeah. I think the shift before was we're going to do stuff to kids. We're going to send them to the office. We're going to punish. We're going to suspend them. We're going to publicly shame, right? We're going to have you stand on the line. We're going to put your clip chart up. We're shifting away from those practices to more solving problems with kids, because we're here to teach. We're here to, if we're thinking about discipline, it's here to teach kids how to, so when they have that experience again, they've got some capacity to ride out the resiliency and have the tools to be able to improve the behavior. But if we're just doing 2 for kids or for them all the time, we're never going to see a shift in their behavior because they're not a part of it. And we often miss asking the kids. I think their reasoning for behavior,
a big part of it.
All the adults come around and like, this is the plan we're gonna do with the kid, and the kid's like, well, that wasn't the problem. I don't understand why we're
Now we have something in place that just actually makes me mad again, and I still have the other problem that already existed because we never addressed it in the first place.
We kind of we put this exhaustive plan in place, and it really was a simple, quick fix. If we would just ask the child, what's going on in here? Here's my expectations. Yeah. But to have the relationship. Yeah. To be able to do that with the kid.
Yeah, you can't just do that. Like, it's going to be way less effective if somebody just pops in and does that. Doesn't have that relationship at all, as opposed to somebody that does have the relationship, has put in the time to get to know the kid. And I think we can sometimes in this old model, and even with a new look of how we do things, if we're asking for help, we can get frustrated because somebody new can pop in and get a result out of a kid. Like, they can, all of a sudden the kid listens to them or whatever. It's kind of like when you're a parent and like somebody else tells your kid, like what to do, and like they'll listen, but if you've told them 25 times. But I think like you can't let yourself get two things. You can't let yourself get too frustrated. Like they listened to that person, but they didn't listen to me. I was saying the same words. I was asking the same thing. Also, if you're one of the people that's in a position that you aren't maybe a classroom teacher and you do tend to like pop in to help out in situations, don't let yourself get too proud of yourself, maybe, or assume that like you have this magical touch all the time, when really maybe it's just like the shift. I think we have to always understand, whether you're a classroom teacher or somebody that's not in the classroom, that the classroom teacher is there all the time. And so they're going to maybe in tough situations not always get the same exact result as somebody that just pops in. Does that all make sense? Like,
Yeah.
I think sometimes I would always call myself, I was in a different position, different place, and I was more of a pop-in person at a couple different times in my career. And people would be like, well, I don't know how you get them to do whatever. They listen to you. And I was always I tried to be very quick to tell people like, oh, I'm just a pop-in person though. Like,
Yeah.
so I can get a different result. If I was with that kid for 6 hours a day, I would be getting a much different result, and they would be pushing back the same way they're pushing back with you.
Yeah. Or I think sometimes it also happens that we always send them out. So the school counselor, the principal, the coach that's in the building, whatever your setup is.
A pop out person.
Pop out
Yeah,
person.
there's a
I
pop
like
in person and a pop out
this
person.
is very this technology.
That's all. Yeah, that's
The
all.
vocabulary
Yeah,
we're
all the
building today is
vocabulary.
incredible. But yeah, the kids are going out. Well, you're riding the resiliency with the kid.
Yeah.
So then you've kind of shifted the authority or power over to that person that's always taking them out to ride whatever with. And so that person establishes a safe, trusting, loving relationship with the kid. So sometimes the shift is, let me come cover your class so that you can go talk or do that with the child so that you're the person when the next thing happens, they know you are going to be that consistent adult.
So maybe like as a classroom teacher, if I'm having particular problems with a kid, you're saying something that could be good to ask of like my principal or a counselor or whoever is, hey, like, could you come in and do something for 25, 30 minutes? Here's what the class is doing. It's real low key. Or could you even create, come in and read to them, or come in and cover, as a middle school or high school teacher, can you cover this one period for me today? I'll have something that's relatively low key for you to do. But can you come cover that so I can take this other kid somewhere and spend time with them one-on-one to kind of help build that relationship? That's kind of what you're saying. And then as an administrator, maybe being willing to let your staff know that's something that you're ready for.
Yeah.
And that it's going to actually have way greater payoff than always just having like a line of kids outside your office waiting to come in that you're going to deal with and being that pop out person like for them. But instead saying, hey, like if you've got a kid that's coming down here, like I'm going to have different times on this day. I'm going to try to set it aside at least a day a week to go and be in those classrooms.
Yeah. And I think it builds respect with your teachers that you're in the classroom doing the instructional piece that we're supposed to be coaching and evaluating them on. Like, go give yourself experience with that new curriculum in the classroom. I think it's just good to be a part of the mix instead of being so outside, always looking in.
It doesn't take long to be like out of the classroom before you stop. It starts getting hard to remember what it's like to be in the classroom every day.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's just how it works.
And then the authenticity that you have with teachers when you're talking through, like, I was teaching that math lesson and that was super confusing as I was looking through like the lesson, or I was doing this read aloud and I had this question, or I was, this one science thing that we try to do. But if you never have those experiences, and it's something I am going to try to get better and better at every year to get yourself back into those classroom practices. I know we shifted some of our reading practices and I kept on saying, I'm going to go in and teach the reading thing. I have yet to have time to do it, but before the end of the year, that's my goal.
Yeah.
So it's more relevant conversations, but it also gives teachers time to go talk with students. So when things come up, connect with your building administrator, school counselor, let them come in and cover during even that like tough, quick, like, is anybody available right now? I really need to go talk.
Yeah, to this kid for 5 minutes, for 3 minutes, but I also can't just leave my room unattended, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think do that. I think one of the big shifts that I keep thinking is just that time to be trained, like on how like the brain works and what these practices really mean and what discipline needs to look like. I think time to implement and practice new things. I think time to be able to like process. Like I really think that's going to be something that's going to have to happen more and more as more and more people keep implementing, because we do second guess ourselves so much. And if we have intentional time set aside to reflect, because we've spent, even like talking about like our building, like we've spent a lot of time training. I think that's the next step though, right? Is like a lot of time for people to reflect as they are now putting practices in place. And like you referenced the one situation, like, well, I don't even know if I was doing that, right? Like, but you like potentially somebody walks away and thinks about that for the next, until they go to bed, because they're worried, like, did I do that right? When in reality, we could be having those conversations to kind of process some of that. And I think that's what's hard, is because we are constrained by time in school. And again, keep going back to this. If you're like a curriculum person, we don't like hate you or anything. Like that's not the case. But like we do get hammered in schools about curriculum all the time, which are rightfully so. I mean, that's the main reason we're there.
Institutions of instruction, sure.
But I think that we have to be really cognizant of the fact that like we can't, like if we only do instruction, like you said, we're only hitting like 2/3 or 1/3 of what, what kids really need and what we're really expected to do.
Yeah. I think in prioritizing, I think just bigger district things, prioritizing people that have expertise and backgrounds to go in and help support. You can bring the one person in for the one day. They go away. They live 20 states away.
Yeah, sure.
And then what,
Sure.
right? So building some real experts within your system to have the capacity to help facilitate, coach, remind, embed, just like we do with instruction
Yeah.
about those practices. And it's going to take somebody to really take that on to really be reflective about data practices and all those kind of things that go with discipline that I'm sure will be another conversation.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of at the end. Did we cover what you covered? Probably not. You had to skip a lot.
Yeah,
didn't you?
discipline. We could go probably 10 episodes, and we probably will. We'll dive into a lot of things. I mean, the impact of school culture and climate, natural consequences, restorative practices.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into this. This is again kind of like we're in still that overview stage, right? Kind of getting that general initial shift.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk more in depth. So from this conversation today, like, what do you really want people to kind of walk away knowing? If they forget the other, 29 minutes of us talking, what's the one thing you want them to remember?
I would say you are in a spot that opportunity to change long-term outcomes and correct systematic issues in our society right now, which is a huge right to think one person, but you really are in a position. It's not easy. It's so worth it. And that your impact will be so great once you take on this shift. You have those relationship practices in place. You have regulation practices in place, and you shift your lens that the kid needs an intervention and experience and not a consequence necessarily all the time, will make a greater output and systematic change. So it's a huge undertaking, but it's necessary right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just that discipline isn't bad. We're going to keep saying, we're going to keep saying it because I feel like that's the big obstacle right now with this work is like feeling like discipline and boundaries and expectations are all bad. And that's what people are saying. And that's not what anybody should be saying if they are really understanding what this is about. So discipline isn't bad. And like, we do need to be training and molding and correcting our students. That's our job. Yeah. And that doesn't mean just academics. That means them as a person as well. And all 3/3 of who they are, right?
Yeah.
All three aspects. Well, we thank you as always for just being a part and joining in this conversation. Again, ask questions, reach out to us, tell us if there are specific things that either didn't make sense or that we're wrong about. Like you said this, that was wrong.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I don't know.
Well, I think it's important that you say that because I think you have to set up the tone for people to give you feedback.
Yeah.
Which we talk all the time. I'm learning, but the feedback piece is really important. You want people to tell you how it's going. You want them to feel comfortable asking you questions. So to be open and allow that forum to happen. So please do it with us too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And ask us questions, give us feedback. We love all of that stuff. We just appreciate you joining in the conversation with us. And now let's go out there and do the work.
Let's do the work. It's hard, but worth it. We're ready.